Okay, as I promised, fat guys in dresses. Here we have our first. This is Krzysztof Zabarski, and as you can see, now it was painted in 1622, as you can tell by the number there on the photo. However, he's an older guy, and he's dressed in the still fashionable dahlia, which is the outer garment, and he's showing off his styling jupon underneath, made out of gold material. If I had to guess, I'd guess it's probably silk. And of course, he's telling us that he's a noble based on his dress and his sword. You notice that the painting is carefully displaying all the items he thinks is important to show future generations. He's got his hand on what is probably the family Bible there on the table. The table is covered in what is likely captured Turkish cloth, and the lovely dahlia that he's wearing as his outer garment is lined in some kind of black fur, and he's got that wonderful blue peacock feather motif worked through it. So we have a pretty good example of a Polish nobleman's painting here. Now, the Poles wore their wealth. They didn't, at this time, Poland was lucky in that they were producing a lot of grain thanks to favorable weather conditions, and the rest of Europe needed a lot of grain. So the Poles found themselves flush with cash. And what did they do? Well, they didn't believe in banks. The Szlachta definitely believed in the philosophy of if you got it, flaunt it. So they bought the most expensive fabrics and items they could wear. One Polish noble lady's estate at her death was listed as having 20,000 rhinestones and a couple of thousand squirrel skins in it. Now, what she planned on doing with those, maybe she's going to slap a bunch of rhinestones on those squirrels and make them a squirrel cape that would rival Liberace, another famous Pole, by the way. But they definitely were all about conspicuous consumption. And this brings up an interesting point. A lot of times with garb, you can put really fancy trim on some linen or some other nice expensive fabric, like a brocade or a silk, and that's what those different cultures would do. Or the Poles didn't do that. The fabric itself was the queen of the ball, the belle of the ball. So what you want to do to make the right fabric choices for your garb is to find the most expensive fabric you can afford, or fabric that fakes it if you can't afford it. And I'll get to the fabric types here in a minute. They wore silks. They had access to cotton. And in fact, some Polish probate inventories list undershirts that have cotton cuffs and collars. And what they would do is, on the parts that would show, they'd put the expensive fabric on the outside so it could be easily seen. If they couldn't afford to have an entire garment made out of cotton, they'd do that. But if because we did have Poland sits in the middle of trade routes between Asia and Europe, it was perfectly acceptable to have access to cotton if you're doing a late period persona. As for earlier period personas, I need to do more research to determine exactly what point cotton became available. So if you know the answer to that question, by all means, let me know. Now, if you look at this guy's painting, he's got a sash on underneath his sword belt. And any Polish nobleman from the 1570s on, even out into the 1800s, they have a sash underneath that sword belt. They got this from the Turks. Now, the reason the Turks became important is because at the Union of Lublin in the 1570s, when 1578, I think it was, or 1574, when Stefan Batory became king of Poland, the emphasis shifted, and it was due to two big events. One was the marriage and ascension of King Batory to the throne of Poland, and also because the end of the Teutonic Wars against the Teutonic Knights. And the Union of Lublin, one of the conditions was Poland got Ukraine. When that happened, Poland's attention naturally turned from west to east. And as it did so, they became more and more conscious, the Tatars and the Ottoman Turks who were along their borders, who raided back and forth, and sent emissaries back and forth, and so on. And eventually, by the time of the Battle of Vienna in 1683, the Poles looked so much like their Turkish opponents that they couldn't differentiate themselves easily from them, so they wore wisps of straw wrapped around themselves so they wouldn't get shot on the battlefield that day. But for us who are in the SC, that's a long time in the future. And the main thing to remember about the Poles is that they loved all kinds of Turkish patterns and Turkish motifs, like the vegetation that you see in this guy's photo. So if you can find flowers or other viney type stuff, go ahead and get it, and if you can work it into your fabric, because they loved it. Anything Oriental, i.e. Persian, Turkish, Ottoman, etc., is great because the Poles wanted as much of that as they could get. So the delier here has its basis in a kaftan and the melding between that and the zsur, the Hungarian zsur, and the saber, which itself is, has its roots in the East by being a curved horseman's weapon, much like the scimitar or the shamsir, that also came over from them. And I'm going to show you a picture here of the famous painting of the famous painting of Stefan Batory by Marcin Kober, and that has more Turkish influences in it. So we'll get to that in just a moment.